Stephen Biddle is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University and Adjunct Senior Fellow for Defense Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Before joining GW faculty in 2012, he was the Roger Hertog Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and previously held the Elihu Root Chair in Military Studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. His book, Military Power, Explaining Victory and Defeat in Modern Battle, has won 4 prizes, including the Council on Foreign Relations Arthur Ross Award Silver Medal, the 2005 Huntington Prize from Harvard University, Olin's Institute for Strategic Studies. His other publications include articles in Foreign Affairs, International Security, The New Republic, The American Interest, The National Interest, and most importantly, Orbis, FPRI's journal. Shorter pieces on military topics in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal, as well as other publications. Dr. Biddle has served as a member of the Defense Policy Board and has presented testimony before congressional committees on issues relating to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, force planning, conventional net assessment, and European arms control. He served on General Stanley McChrystal's initial strategic assessment team in Kabul in 2009, on General David Petraeus' joint strategic assessment team in Baghdad in 2007, and as a senior advisor to General Petraeus' Central Command Assessment Team in Washington in 2008 and 9. He was awarded the U.S. Army Superior Civilian Service Medal in 2003 and again in 2006, and was presented with the U.S. Army Commander's Award for Public Service in Baghdad in 2007. His doctorate is from Harvard. It's a great pleasure to introduce Stephen Biddle.
Introduction. I understand that someone here is from Conrad High School. Is that correct? Just as well. We beat them my senior year in football. So I just wanted to make sure that there wasn't a lot of bitterness and someone I needed to avoid during Q&A. Proud graduate of John Dickinson High School myself. I was given the agenda of looking at the post-9/11 wars, including Afghanistan, Iraq, the Philippines, and that unspecified more, which of course is an enormous agenda, 13 years of more or less continuous warfare, multiple theaters, multiple political systems, different dynamics, different underlying casus belli, with an agenda that's sweeping. My choices in dealing with it in a short presentation are either to be superficial or to talk real fast. So I thought what I'd do is be superficial and talk real fast. And to give you an idea of what I'm going to try and do in that kind of rapid tour to horizon of an enormous stretch of warfare, I thought I'd start with what I see as one of the more important themes that cut across all of this, which is, I think, when you look at U.S. military experience worldwide since September 11, 2001, what you see is a recurring attempt to wage multiple wars on the cheap, and to wage multiple wars on the cheap in ways that have tended to create ragged, often unsatisfying, incomplete, and ambiguous results, but that stem from perfectly understandable underlying incentives. We have long believed that as the sole superpower, in possession of extraordinarily sophisticated technology and in the midst of what some have long seen as a revolution in military affairs, that we ought to be able to leverage these kinds of technological advantages to enable us to do important things in important theaters around the world without mobilizing a World War II-size, World War II-scale military. The problem that has systematically posed for us, however, is that while we have overwhelming military force, overwhelmingly sophisticated military technology, and great ability to direct lethal force in particular places and times, we have also been stuck with a systematic asymmetry in underlying interests between ourselves and the local entities that we were waging war against in each of these theaters. Either because you believe that the United States, starting in 2001, is going to be waging a war of decades or potentially generations, and therefore we need to keep our cost and investment in any one theater low, or whether you believe that particular presidential administrations, especially the one after 2009, is insufficiently committed to the stakes, for a constellation of reasons, a series of American administrations and theater military commands have tried to restrict the scale of effort that the United States invests in particular theaters to reflect what was understood to be limited, real but limited, U.S. national security interests in these conflicts. The locals do not have limited interests in the local conflict. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the Philippines, in any of the other theaters in which we've been waging war, for the locals, this conflict is literally existential, and the interests are approximately unlimited. And what that has meant is that we get ourselves into situations where the local opponent is willing to escalate and mobilize more of their society's potential military effort for the waging of war, whereas our willingness to escalate at the same time has had limits to it. And the result of that has been a series of ragged, unsatisfying outcomes in particular places and particular theaters in the course of this war. And the only way the United States has of getting out of this bind, of a dilemma in which our interests are limited, our opponent's interests are essentially unlimited, what then do we do is not to have started down this trail in the first place, to have decided way back in 2001 or perhaps early 2002 that the threat posed by al-Qaeda and international terrorism does not warrant the waging of war, ought to be treated as an espionage problem and as a crime problem as it was before 2001, and therefore we're just going to say no to all this and not start down these slippery slopes. That was politically impossible in 2001. It's probably politically impossible today. And what that does, I think, is to set up a larger story for the history of U.S. military involvement after 9/11 that looks a lot like a Shakespearean tragedy, in which, because of the underlying nature of the situation, you're looking at a process that is very likely to end up in a lot of suffering and not as much satisfaction as you would hope, but that wasn't particularly avoidable. It's a long litany that people have listed of mistakes that we made, things we could have done better, things we could have done different. I suspect, and maybe we can get into this in Q&A, that if you go back and fix all of those mistakes, if you still come to the conclusion that the threat posed by al-Qaeda in 2001 warrants the waging of war, then you're stuck in this dilemma, and there's no easy way out of it other than ragged, unsatisfying, gray zone in-between outcomes with significant casualties and some but incomplete realization of our aims. Now, in consonance with kind of viewing this thing as Shakespearean tragedy, the way I'm going to approach the talk is a play in 3 acts, where the first act is Afghanistan from the 1990s through about 2003. The second act then shifts the scene to Iraq from 2003 to about 2008. And then the third act is going to come back to Afghanistan, especially from 2009 into the present. We'll see if I get to the point where I can then sketch where I think this is going from there. But that's what I would like to do. So let's start the story with Afghanistan. And to tell the story of Afghanistan, you have to start in the 1990s. My wife is an actual historian. I'm a political scientist. I practice history without a license. The problem with real historians is that they always want to take the story back further. Happily, she's an air power historian, so you can't take the story past the Wright brothers. In Afghanistan, you have this basic problem. How far back do we go? The Stone Age? I mean, where do you want to start? But I'm going to arbitrarily truncate the history of Afghanistan and start in the 1990s. In the Civil War among Afghan former Mujahideen warlords that resulted from the Soviet withdrawal from the country. This civil war was extremely bitter, chaotic, atomized, multiple actors fighting multiple wars with shifting sides and resulting in tremendous damage and suffering to Afghans of all ethnicities and associated with all warlords. and also radically threatening the national security interests of Afghanistan's neighbor to the east, Pakistan. Imagine what Americans would think if Canada broke into an n-dimensional, everyone against everyone, free-for-all civil war that was killing tens of thousands of people every year. We would view this as a national security threat to the United States of the very first order. Pakistan eventually responded to this chaos on the other side of its border by creating an organization in the south of the country called the Taliban. The Pakistani Intelligence Service, the ISI, created the Taliban, provided weapons, provided assistance, provided intelligence information, provided money, and equipped and enabled them to expand rapidly out of their original base in the south of the country in Kandahar, north and west, in an effort to stabilize what was going on their border, and especially to stabilize it via a puppet that could reflect Pakistan's national security interests, which were centrally dominated by a long-term conflict with India to Pakistan's east, with whom they had fought a series of wars since their independence, broken away from India, and lost all of them. Pakistan, throughout that process, had been desperately worried that an alignment between India to its east and Afghanistan to its west would encircle it, deny its strategic depth in the event of a possible future war with India, and seriously undermine Pakistan's survival prospects. The Pakistanis pursued this through a series of approaches. Originally, they pursued it through the waging of conventional war. That didn't work out so well for them. They managed to lose in sequence every war they fought with the Indians. They also pursued it eventually through a nuclear weapons program, and they pursued it through a program of irregular asymmetric conflict in which the Pakistani government stood up a collection of Islamist militant groups within Pakistan that were designed to fight asymmetric irregular war against India over the disputed territory of Kashmir on the border between India and Pakistan. That Islamist militant agenda vis-a-vis India then connected with the construction of an Islamist radical government in Afghanistan under the Taliban. The Taliban proved, with Pakistani backing, to be highly successful, and over the course of a year or two of active fighting, managed to take over about 85% of the land area of the country of Afghanistan. They did not, however, take all of it. About 15% of the country remained under the control of rebel forces, what subsequently became known as the Northern Alliance, that was waging an ongoing, stalemated, deadlocked civil war with the Taliban government. In the course of that deadlocked civil war with the Taliban government, the Taliban relied on a variety of outside actors to help them in its conduct. Of course, Pakistan, but also Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And what bin Laden and Al-Qaeda brought to the table was partly money, partly political assistance, but especially foreign fighters and expertise. Bin Laden had fought with the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan. When he came back later, he set up a series of camps in Afghanistan that Americans think of as terrorist camps, and they were in part, but their primary purpose was to run foreign fighters through an essentially traditional infantry tactical curriculum to produce fighters to serve on the front line in the Taliban's civil war against the Northern Alliance. Bin Laden, in this score, was quite helpful to the Taliban government. But whereas the Taliban government was overwhelmingly interested in what was going on in Afghanistan, bin Laden had much, much bigger ambitions, resulting eventually, of course, in the 9/11 attacks against the United States. Once 9/11 occurred, the United States government responded by issuing two ultimata. one to the Taliban government and one to the Pakistani government. The ultimatum to the Taliban government basically said, turn over your house guest. Give us bin Laden or else. And the Taliban government says, no, we'll take the or else. The ultimatum to the Pakistani government said, cease your support and assistance to the Taliban government and cease your assistance and support to Islamist militant groups that share their objectives, or else. The implicit or else being the threat to topple the Pakistani government. The Afghans took the ultimatum and said no. The Pakistanis took the ultimatum and said, you win. Okay, we agree. We will do what you say. And proceeded to end their formal alliance with the Taliban and announce that they were going to break with Islamist militants within their borders, which they did grudgingly. After all, they liked these people. They created the Taliban, after all. They created the militant groups within their borders. They created this because they were useful, because they thought they were important, because they were aligned with Pakistani state government policy and of assistance in the ongoing chronic conflict with India. They were now stuck with a dilemma. Do we continue our pre-existing policy and run the risk of an American military campaign that will topple our government? That doesn't look so great. Or do we give in to what the Americans want and piss off lots of people who are not nice folks, are well-armed, violent, and tend to be ideologically extremist? Given this choice between leukemia and the plague, Pakistan chose plaguemia by trying to split the difference. Instead of completely eradicating these groups and lining up as Jeffersonian Democrats in support of the American Global Project, what they did instead was to cut their formal relationships with them, but quietly allow them to continue. And what that brilliant strategy managed to do is to piss them all off, but not destroy any of them. All of these militant groups immediately concluded that the Pakistani government had aligned itself with the great Satan and is now on the wrong side of what they saw as the great historical conflict. But the Pakistani government didn't destroy them or eradicate them, so they were still around, but now hostile to the Pakistani government. In the meantime, while all this was going on in Pakistan, the United States begins the military campaign against the Taliban government within the country of Afghanistan. The way the U.S. Army wanted to wage that conflict was to send a force in excess of 100,000 American conventional soldiers to Afghanistan and wage a campaign to topple the government and replace it with something we liked better. And this idea went over like a lead balloon with the George W. Bush administration and their Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. Partly because Rumsfeld believed that we were in the midst of a revolution in military affairs that ought to enable us to move faster, be leaner, be lethal at a distance, not need this enormous dinosaur legacy military to do old-fashioned conventional invasions. But also because they believed it would take approximately 743 years, and maybe a few months, to deploy 100,000 American soldiers to one of the most logistically forbidding spots on the Earth's planet. No seacoast, surrounded by mountains, next to no infrastructure, and at the time, as you may recall, thinking back to the world of 2001, the United States had just had this shocking, breathtaking event of 3,000 Americans being killed in a terrorist incident, and for all we know, bin Laden had 4 or 5 more of those up his sleeve, and there were going to be more potentially real soon. And the Bush administration was desperately worried, for perfectly sensible reasons, that they could not let the score go to 2-0 without doing something. They were worried that if we didn't begin military actions against the Taliban government and a second World Trade Center attack occurred, that impeachment would be too good for them and they'd be run out of town, by crowds of people carrying torches with pitchforks. They wanted faster action, and the way they got faster action was by deploying a handful of special forces teams to interact with a handful of CIA operatives who were already on the ground in Afghanistan and local allies in the form of this Northern Alliance that, after all, was still waging war against the Taliban government and controlled contiguous land area of roughly 15% of the country in the north. So we inserted special forces teams into this territory that our local allies controlled and teamed it with standoff precision firepower in the form of the U.S. Air Force and, to some extent, the U.S. Navy. And this novel military combination of special forces teams that were acting mostly as spotters and target acquirers for firepower that was coming overwhelmingly from the air, in conjunction with an indigenous local ally whose role could be limited to doing nothing more than screening the special forces target acquirers from Taliban infiltrators long enough for the air power to do all the killing, proved to be shockingly effective. And in a campaign of less than 2 months, toppled the Taliban government and sent the Taliban and their al-Qaeda allies into flight across the Durand Line and into Pakistan, where the Pakistanis claimed they had no idea where they were. They didn't think they were there at all. But in all likelihood, from very early on, their locations were known to the Pakistani intelligence service, and the Pakistanis were at least tacitly allowing them to exist, quite possibly assisting them much more aggressively than that, although until the Pakistani archives open, that will remain an issue of some degree of speculation. Once the Taliban government falls, we have a complete vacuum in Afghanistan. Taliban are gone. Now who's going to run the place? We convened a conference in Bonn, Germany in 2001 where a collection of outside governments got together, nominated Hamid Karzai, a southern Pashtun who for a brief time had been a Taliban operative before deciding that the Taliban weren't particularly congenial to his interest in fleeing into India. And we took Hamid Karzai, decided he was the ideal future leader of Afghanistan, and created a new government around him in a blueprint ultimately ratified in the 2004 Constitution of Afghanistan that set up what was, on paper at least, the most centralized governing system on the planet. Every meaningful administrative public policy function in Afghanistan under the 2001 Constitution is controlled in Kabul. Provinces, think American states, under the 2004 Constitution, do not have the ability to raise tax revenue. They do not have the ability to write budgets. Their state governors, provincial governors in Afghanistan, aren't elected by the people of the province. They're named by the president of Afghanistan in Kabul. It's a remarkably centralized system. And it was done that way because we were desperately afraid that this vacuum was going to be filled by warlordism and civil war of the kind that Afghanistan had seen immediately prior to the American invasion. The way to prevent that sort of centrifugal force and breakup of the country into warlord fiefdoms was centralized power and authority. That centralizing agenda was radically at odds, unfortunately, with Afghan political culture, which is among the most decentralized in the world. The sources of local governing authority in Afghan traditional political culture are often no broader than the village or perhaps the district. This sort of overlay had the effect of setting up a serious degree of tension between the design for the country's governance and the practice of its governance, We then provided very little in the way of resources to square this circle. The Bush administration was terribly worried that if we engaged in some massive nation-building program in Afghanistan, the result would be failure and something that looked like the war against the Soviet occupiers. And as a result, we had one of the smallest of all small footprint approaches to managing the country after the fall of the Taliban. Even by the end of 2003, there were fewer than 24,000 uniformed armed security providers in a country of about 33 million. That's fewer uniformed security providers than there are uniformed police in the New York City Police Department, nationwide. At the same time, attention had already begun to shift towards Iraq. And with that, I'm going to move to the second act. The Bush administration was desperately worried about terrorism, and the particular form of terrorism they worried the most about was terrorism with weapons of mass destruction. And when they sat back and looked around the world, they conceived that this is a global problem, and they asked, where is it likeliest that the terrorists who struck us and killed 3,000 of us on 9/11 might get their hands on something bigger and better? They turned to Iraq. Now, the motivations for the invasion of Iraq in 2003 were complicated, multidimensional, and different for every single actor in the Bush administration. I'm very reluctant to cite one motive, or even two, or even three, for the decision to invade the country. It was some complicated amalgam of concern that Saddam Hussein, they believed, had an ongoing program to develop nuclear in addition to chemical weapons and might transfer them to a terrorist, concern or hope or ambition that if the Ba'athist autocracy police state in Iraq could be replaced with a democracy, it would lead to political change elsewhere in the region, and democratization region-wide in the Mideast would shrink and eventually eliminate Osama bin Laden's recruiting base. And generalized concern that Saddam Hussein was an aggressor who had invaded his neighbors before and might do so again in the future. Some combination of worries that Iraq, left unfettered, could equip terrorists with radically more lethal weapons, and concern that, and hope that fixing Iraq could dry up the recruitment base for terrorists around the world aiming at the United States, resulted in a decision to invade the country, which occurred in March of 2003. The initial invasion in March of 2003 was the product of another wrestling match between the military, especially the Army and Rumsfeld and the Bush administration, over how big a force to send. Elements of the Bush administration wanted to redo the Afghan model. Handful of special forces, lots of air power. The Army wanted to send 400 million troops, invade the country and stabilize it. What we got was something in between. That something in between was nonetheless big enough, in conjunction with modern 21st century firepower, to destroy the Iraqi state military quite quickly. But like Afghanistan, there was then a security vacuum. And unlike Afghanistan and Iraq, the result of that security vacuum was massive rioting, chaos in which looting broke out, and in which people who had lived most of their political lives in an autocratic police state suddenly became desperately worried about what was going to happen now that the police state is gone. Because Iraq is a deeply divided society. All societies have divisions, so does Afghanistan. The divisions within Iraq were central to the war to come. And in particular, I want to emphasize three. Arab Sunni Muslims, Arab Shiite Muslims, and Kurdish Sunni Muslims. For most of for Saddam Hussein's entire rule, Saddam, a Sunni, had ruled as a minority, most Iraqis are Shiites, over a Shiite majority with an iron fist. The result of that oppressive iron fist was to build up a long list of desires for future revenge on the part of Shiites especially, but to some extent Kurds, and fear on the part of Sunnis who were doing the oppression, that if the Shiites ever got in control, things would be very unpleasant because the scores to be settled will not be fun for us. But it worked, more or less, because you had a police state controlling things. Now, all of a sudden, bam, the police state is gone. And now everybody is very nervous about everybody else. Sunnis think Shiites are going to even the score. Shiites think this is their opportunity, but are afraid that Sunnis might take over again, and they'll be back in the position they were before. Kurds, sitting on top of major oil fields in the north, are afraid that everybody's going to poach on them. The result of that was that from very early on, you had the development of an insurgency to follow the initial high-intensity phase of the war, in which initially former regime elements associated with the Ba'athist Sunni government and later a broader alliance of Sunnis at large decide to wage war against a U.S.-installed Iraqi government that is Shiite. For most of this conflict, from 2004-ish, when it first reached escape velocity, until 2008, when the violence fell, the basic military strategy being pursued by the Sunni part of this ethno-sectarian identity war was, we are going to impose cost on the Americans and persuade them to withdraw because this Shiite government is basically a puppet regime of the Americans being propped up by U.S. military power, and if we can get them out of the country and set up a mano-a-mano, one-on-one struggle with this Shiite puppet, we Sunnis, we may be a minority, but we are ruthless. We showed that by running the country for the last generation. If we can get the Americans out, we can mop the floor with these Shiites, restore the proper balance of power within the country, restore Sunni rule, and go back to the way it was. And for most of the war, they were imposing a lot of cost on the Americans. And it looked like this strategy might work. Then they screwed up. In February of 2006, Sunni insurgents bombed the Shiite shrine of the Golden Dome Mosque in Samarra. And what the bombing of the Golden Dome Mosque of Samarra in February of 2006 did was to convince a collection of non-government Shiite armed militias that had been stood up to try and protect Shiite populations against Sunni attacks, but had mostly been standing on the sidelines through most of the war up to date. They sallied forth and did battle, especially with the U.S. Army, on rare occasions, but most of the time they were happy to let the Iraqi government forces and the Americans do most of the heavy lifting. When the Golden Dome Mosque gets bombed, they said, enough is enough. Enough is enough. The government can't defend us. The Americans aren't taking this seriously. We are taking this matter into our own hands, and we are going to wage this war and win it the right way. And they come into the war on the offensive en masse. And the result of that is a year-long, intense, ethno-sectarian urban war, especially in Baghdad, but throughout central Iraq, in which the Iraqi state government was tacitly aligned with most of the Shiite militias and unwilling to intervene forcefully to shut them down, and the U.S. military, which would have, if we could have, was too small in theater to do it, and mostly ended up being relegated to standing on the sidelines and watching Shiite militias and Sunni insurgents go at it in the streets of Baghdad. And the result of this was to provide precisely the one-on-one, mano-a-mano struggle between the Shiites and the Sunnis that the Sunnis had always been trying to bring about. And to their horror, the Shiites mopped the floor with them. And the city of Baghdad, which before the war had been a patchwork sectarian quilt of Sunni and Shia and the occasional Kurd, became increasingly Shiite. As the Jaish al-Mahdi, the Badr brigades in the south, and other Shiite militias gradually knocked the Sunnis out of one after another neighborhood that had been Sunni for generations. And what this did was to convince the Sunnis that their previous strategic appreciation of this war had some minor difficulties associated with it. If we actually get the Americans out, the result probably is not going to be Sunni restoration. It's going to be genocide at the hands of the Shia, who have shown themselves to be at least as ruthless as we are. And what this did is to create an interest on the part of lots of the Sunni secular insurgency in Iraq to find a new ally to get out from under this war. And that set up a huge internal fight between al-Qaeda's local Iraqi affiliate, AQI or al-Qaeda in Iraq, under a fellow by the name of Zarqawi, and the secular Sunni insurgency made up of indigenous Iraqis who wanted to realign and end the war. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, with a heavy input of foreign fighters and connection to al-Qaeda's global headquarters now in Pakistan, had no interest in ending this war. They were in this to kill foreigners, especially Americans. The result of this Sunni interest in getting out from under the conflict and al-Qaeda's complete intolerance for this was a huge internecine battle between Sunnis who wanted to realign and al-Qaeda who wanted to annihilate anybody who thought of realigning. This kind of factionalism is very common in internal civil warfare. And it is a huge threat to insurgents and rebel groups. If you allow somebody to break off and align with your enemy, you run enormous risks because guerrillas depend for survival against better equipped, larger, more lethal state militaries on concealment. Guerrillas hide among the population and use the fact that the government can't figure out who's an insurgent and who's an innocent civilian to protect themselves. If part of your group breaks off an alliance with the government, the Romulan invisibility cloak is lifted. And all of a sudden, the turncoats start telling the government who the insurgent leadership is, where the safe houses are, where the bomb-making factories are, where the improvised explosive devices have been laid, what the cellular structure of the rebellion is. And if you give that kind of information to a military like the American that has plenty of firepower once we know who to direct it against, this is extremely dangerous. And the result is al-Qaeda counterattacked as lethally as they could. This was not actually the first time that Sunnis had decided they were fed up with al-Qaeda and wanted to get out from under them. Al-Qaeda are not pleasant people, even for co-religionists. If you don't practice the faith in the way they see fit, they will kill your children. They will deliver heads in shoeboxes on your doorstep. They are made up mostly of usurpers and upstarts outside the traditional tribal authority structure that nobody liked and nobody trusted. Every now and then through the course of the war, some Sunni tribal leader had said, "I've had enough with you guys, I'm out of here," and tried to realign with the government. And that produced the inevitable vicious counterattack. And prior to the very end of 2006 and the beginning of 2007, those counterattacks always cut off the realignment at the knees, drove the upstarts back into the fold, and the war ground on. The difference in 2007 was the surge. The Bush administration, through most of this war, had been trying to wage Iraq on the cheap. The theory was we will build up an Iraqi indigenous military and we'll hand the war off to them. Let them deal with it. And we'll do some democratization and some economic development, but our primary strategy was build up an indigenous Iraqi military, hand the war off to them, and we'll get the heck out of here. That was a lousy plan for a war that was essentially a highly mobilized ethno-sectarian identity conflict. We thought we could build up an indigenous Iraqi military that Iraqis would view as a defender of all Iraqis. Iraqi Sunnis looked at the Shiite national government armed force and concluded it was a sectarian militia on steroids, dug their heels in and fought back harder. This plan just wasn't working. Finally, at the end of 2006, the administration trashes it, completely reverses course, reinforces the military presence in Iraq by about a third, but centrally changes the doctrine and the intent and the strategy. Where now, instead of building up an Iraqi military to do the fighting, we are going to do population security. We will disperse our forces among the Iraqi population. We are not going to operate in large fortified bases out in the desert. Patrolling is going to be done on foot, not on vehicles. We are going to be in constant contact with Iraqi populations. And what that did in the context of an emerging Sunni realignment, what was originally called the Anbar Awakening, because it began in Anbar province, later got called the Concerned Local Citizens Movement. It may have been the worst acronym in the whole war, right? It conjures up the League of Women Voters, little old ladies in tennis shoes with surveys. The Concerned Local Citizens were hardened killers. This was the Sunni insurgency changing sides. Then they got called the Sons of Iraq. What this new American policy of the surge did for the Sons of Iraq is it made it possible for them to make contact with Americans without al-Qaeda knowing it, because there were Americans in the marketplace every day, walking by, buying trinkets, starting conversations. All you needed to do was make it known that you would like a realignment. That made the realignment survivable. Because unlike past attempts that got wiped out by al-Qaeda counterattack, the new realignment had the surge to defend it. And the result of that combination of American military power in contact with enough Sunnis to defend them, and realigning Sunnis who knew who the holdouts were, resulted in violence in Iraq plummeting over the course of 2007, and the casualty rate of both Iraqi civilians and American military dropping by a factor of 10. But the reason that happened was not the destruction of the bad guys or the elimination of the insurgency. It was the result of a series of very decentralized ceasefire arrangements in which the Sunni insurgency, usually in negotiations with individual American brigade commanders, did their own deals one by one and stood down, but with their weapons and with their troops and with their pre-existing leadership. And that created a potentially unstable, dangerous situation in which violence was way down, but the society was still just as divided as, say, the Balkans were during the Bosnia and Kosovo conflicts, where you would not have expected that Orthodox Christian Serbs, Bosnian Muslims, and Croatian Catholics would all just get over it all and live together happily the day after Dayton. Similarly, in Iraq, Sunnis and Shia weren't simply going to get over it all and come to like each other the day after a ceasefire agreement got signed. In the Balkans, we stabilized this inherently unstable situation with a large force of foreign peacekeepers. In Iraq, the peacekeeping function was the U.S. military. And the central function that the U.S. military was playing in Iraq from 2008 until we withdrew was essentially interpositional peacekeeping of the same kind that we had in the Balkans. We weren't willing to stay as long in Iraq. Now, with that, let me very quickly go to the third act, back to Afghanistan. Meanwhile, in our other theater of war, the Afghan insurgency and counterinsurgency had been limping along. The U.S. handed the war off to NATO in order to focus on Iraq in August of 2003. In the meantime, the Taliban in Pakistan had been licking their wounds, building up, and re-infiltrating the country. And by the time the Obama administration took office in 2009, that re-infiltration had radically undermined the stability of the Afghan government. And the Obama administration now had to decide what to do about this. They had campaigned on the promise that they were going to fight the good war in Afghanistan, get out of the bad war in Iraq, so they knew they were going to reinforce to some degree. The question is, to what degree? And the problem they had with this is that when they looked at the U.S. interests at stake in Afghanistan, they did not see this as World War III. They did not see the Taliban threat as Nazi Germany. They were a lot more worried about Osama bin Laden than they were Mullah Omar and the former Taliban government of Afghanistan. And even Osama bin Laden, they thought, was hiding in a cave somewhere in Pakistan and hadn't been able to launch anything remotely like September 11 ever since. What they were primarily worried about was not mainly that if the Afghanistan project failed, the Karzai government fell, that al-Qaeda would set up base camps again in Afghanistan. That was, of course, a possibility. There's nothing particularly unique about Afghanistan in that score. There are dozens of places around the world where al-Qaeda wasn't at the moment, but might in the future set up bases to attack us. If you're going to deploy 70,000 or more American troops anywhere around the world that al-Qaeda isn't but might be, you're going to run out of troops long before al-Qaeda runs out of prospective bases. What the Obama administration was mainly worried about in Afghanistan was if the project in Afghanistan failed, that would destabilize Pakistan on the other side of the border. And Pakistan was an active nuclear weapons state. Iraq, it turned out, had shut down its nuclear weapons program. They were prepared to restart it again later, but that's something we can talk about in Q&A. Pakistan, on the other hand, has one, already ready to go, with use codes, with delivery systems, nuclear weapons state, and Pakistan by this time is in the midst of a fairly intensive civil war of its own, because those militant groups that got pissed off at Pervez Musharraf when he knuckled under George W. Bush's coercive pressure back in 2001, had subsequently begun an active war against him. And by many metrics, that internal Pakistani insurgency was not going very well for the government. The primary reason the administration believed to worry at all about Afghanistan is what might happen in Pakistan if this failed. And the Pashtun ethnic group, primarily associated with the Taliban insurgency in Afghanistan, is actually a cross-border ethnic population with more members in Pakistan than in Afghanistan, and is centrally associated with some of the insurgency activity against the Pakistani government in Islamabad. For the Obama administration, what was at stake in Afghanistan was primarily its effect on its neighbor. This is not trivial. If Pakistan collapses, that nuclear arsenal could breach containment. That's about the only way I can think of that a terrorist might actually get their hands on a usable nuclear weapon. But it's a very indirect effect. You could succeed in Afghanistan at huge effort and sacrifice. But if the Pakistani government continues to screw things up on their side of the Durand line, they might collapse anyway. Terrorists might get their hands on a nuclear weapon anyway. And all this sacrifice in Afghanistan would be for nothing. Alternatively, we could screw things up in Afghanistan, Karzai could fall. And if the Pakistani government gets their act in gear and actually starts mobilizing the resources of the state to wage their own counterinsurgency, they may survive anyway. Afghanistan affects outcomes in Pakistan, but indirectly and by degree. And what the administration wanted to do was to find some centrist, middle ground, reasonable, limited means of pursuing what they thought were real but limited stakes in this war. And the result of that has been years of endless toing and froing and deliberation and changes of decisions and backs and forths between people in the administration like Vice President Biden who believed that the stakes just weren't worth it and we should go low, deploy a force no bigger than we did originally in Afghanistan, and emphasize drone strikes against the people we really care about, al-Qaeda in Pakistan. And the military and the Defense Department that wanted to invest enough resources to stabilize Afghanistan once and for all, so as to eliminate its risk of destabilizing Pakistan, and the administration triangulated and ended up in between. which has the happy property of being enough to be expensive, but not enough to succeed. And what that has produced today in Afghanistan is a situation in which, in my view, we have an essentially deadlocked war, in which after 13 years of fighting, a peak U.S. strength of 100,000 soldiers and a peak U.S. investment of about $120 billion a year, we have now built up an Afghan indigenous military that is probably capable of holding the line and controlling what we have cleared for them, but is probably not capable of expanding the Afghan government's zone of control very much. And because the reinforcements that the Obama administration ordered were not large enough to completely stabilize the country by the end of the deadline they established, the Taliban continue to hold enough strategically decisive terrain, especially in the east, but to some extent in the south of the country, that they will remain militarily viable for the foreseeable future. And what that does is to create a situation in which we can keep this war on life support if we want, indefinitely, as long as the U.S. Congress keeps paying the bills to keep a roughly 350,000 person radically expanded Afghan National Security Force in the field and fighting. This force, which I think is now big enough and good enough to hold what it owns but not expand it very much, has an annual operating budget of about $6.5 billion. That is twice the entire income stream for the Afghan government. Everything the Afghan government needs to do needs to be funded out of a resource stream that is half what's necessary to pay for its security forces. What that means is somebody else, who's that going to be, is going to have to pay the bills to keep them in the field if they're going to stay in the field sustaining this stalemate. And what that means in turn is that the strategic logic of the Afghan campaign at this point in Act 3 is that it has devolved into a contest in stamina between the Taliban and the U.S. Congress. The decisive theater in the war at the moment is Capitol Hill. And unless you think that the Congress is going to stick to it in this longer than Mullah Omar and the Taliban will, the eventual denouement, if U.S. policy continues as it's currently configured, is the Afghan National Security Forces will eventually be defunded. When that happens, they will break up along factional lines. The government will collapse and we'll be right back to the 1990s, in which neither of the interests we have at stake in Afghanistan will be met. Afghan territory could be used as base camps for terrorists to attack us, and chaos in Afghanistan could easily swamp a Pakistani government whose own counterinsurgency effort is on the edge between success and failure. The only off-ramp out of a scenario in which we eventually lose outright in Afghanistan by defunding is a compromised negotiated settlement in the meantime, which is exactly the kind of ragged, unsatisfying, not complete failure, but certainly not complete victory outcome that we see in Iraq, or that we see in the Philippines, or that we see in lots of other places. Now, I've gone on longer, I suspect, than anyone can tolerate. Shall I end this unhappy tale with the story of ragged, partial, incomplete realization of interests in each of the two major theaters of war and go to Q&A?
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. We'll open for questions. Art Sear.
I have a question, if I may. You could ask hosts of questions about the future, but as historians, we like to find turning points and moments in history. And after having read State of Denial, I'm really curious what you think about when Garner turned the CPA over to Bremer, and Bremer's decision to both disarm the military and de-Ba'athify the government. Did that have the result that at least Woodward would seem to imply of screwing us in Iraq? And if so, could we have done it any differently? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, among the litany of screw-ups that people hope if we had done differently might have produced a better outcome is the disestablishment of the Iraqi military and the de-Baathification program early in the U.S. presence in Iraq. I agree that those things were mistakes. Bremer has argued since then that he didn't have any choice, that the Iraqi military had disestablished itself voluntarily in order to escape American firepower during the upcountry march in March and April of 2003, and had gone, that there was no Iraqi military left. I think if he'd been willing to be more creative, and at some level that was clearly true, right? There weren't Iraqi, the Talakalna division was not in its garrison defending a perimeter in its base areas by the time Bremer took over. If Bremer had been willing to be more entrepreneurial and creative about it, I think he probably could have found a way to locate these people, reestablish the old Ba'athist military or something like it, and pay them, and that would have helped at the margin. The problem is that Ba'athist military would almost certainly have been under the command of a Shiite government. And as we've seen from Nouri al-Maliki's behavior, especially since we withdrew, but even from the day he took power, Nouri al-Maliki's understanding of the political history of Iraq is that Iraqi politics is a zero-sum, n-dimensional game where the second place and lower finishers all hang from a noose. And as a result, either you monopolize power and rule, or you die. And his version of no-holds-barred, bare-knuckles politics in Iraq, I think, would have been the case for anybody who had taken power into those in that setting, unless the United States was willing to stay and exert the kind of coercive leverage that we did, in my view, in 2007, but neither before nor after. And if you had simply set up the Shiite government that we were going to set up and handed them this military instrument, the former regime and Sunni tribal leaders, I think, would have felt radically threatened, and you still would have had an insurgency. It probably would have mounted more slowly. It might have been less virulent, but I think it was eventually going to shake down along similar lines because of the underlying divided nature of the society and the radical fear that they all had as a result of a generation of police state rule by a Sunni minority. So that's why I tend to think, yes, there are a variety of things we should have done differently. And the aggressive de-Baathification and the cashiering and disestablishment of the Iraqi military were mistakes I would have preferred we had gone about differently. But at the end of the day, the underlying problem is the locals in this kind of fearful, highly mobilized ethno-sectarian identity war are scared to death of each other, and the stakes to them look like genocide if they get this wrong. The stakes just weren't that high to us. They weren't zero, but we were not going to mobilize 1 million soldiers, send them to Iraq to reestablish order the way Saddam had done it, but in a more democratic context. There was no way the Bush administration was going to make that kind of investment in this theater. The locals were willing to do that.
Just for the record, that was from Patrick to Art, not Art Sear, and now we'll turn to Art Sear.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you very much for an extremely articulate and clear presentation. I'd like to ask you to expand on the characteristics and views of the population in Afghanistan. One of the benefits of being in a small college is actually getting to know a large number of very fine young people. Dima Karimi is a quite heroic Afghan immigrant who recently graduated from Carthage. She has quite a harrowing personal story. She's also very, very articulate and well-informed regarding not just the impact of cell phones, but also television, all kinds of technology that seems to be having a dramatic informational, educational, mobilizing impact on the population. Many years ago, the notion of technology driving political modernization turned out to be a mirage in the context of the Vietnam Revolution. Afghanistan's very different. The Taliban's very different. Participation in the recent presidential election seems to be quite impressive. To what extent do you think the population may be becoming active and mobilized, especially women, in ways that would be helpful to our interests?
if you want to take a Shakespearean tragedy lens through which to look at this conflict, one of the particularly tragic potential consequences is the effect of failure on a class of Afghans that have risen up after 2001 who look American, act American, aspire to the kinds of freedoms and education that Americans enjoy, and can thank the intervention and the toppling of the Taliban for that status, and whose fate, if the future government of Afghanistan collapses, is extremely dark. Americans tend to view Afghanistan as this kind of 12th century backwater, hopelessly primitive, hopelessly violent, changed little, if any, since 2001. And whereas Afghanistan is still grindingly dramatically poor and deeply, deeply corrupt, that's not to say it hasn't changed a lot since 2001, because it has. You would think that a country that was absorbing hundreds of billions of dollars from outside annually, especially since 2009, would show some change, and in fact it has. If any of you get the opportunity to visit the country, lovely place, a little light on après-ski, but beautiful mountains, just wonderful landscape. If you get the chance to visit, I strongly suggest that you take a tour of Tolo TV's offices in Kabul. Saad Mohseni, the CEO of Tolo TV, has set up an operation that looks exactly like NBC News, full of young hipsters with kind of geek glasses and jeans that are too tight and cell phones on every hand, who are well-educated, tremendously Western in outlook, tremendously optimistic about the future, have the potential to make something of this society in the future, and owe all of that to the fall of the Taliban and the Western military presence, and are desperately worried that it might all go away, and they have reason to be worried. And it's not just educated youth, a small but important subset of the Afghan population. The Afghan GDP has more than tripled since 2001. Access to basic health care has more than tripled since 2001. Infant mortality is down by a third since 2001. Literacy is going to rise by more than a factor of 8 over the next generation because of the radical increase in school enrollment. None of this is to say that Afghanistan isn't a radically poor country, but it is to say that the notion that nothing has changed and nothing has improved since 2001 is overstated. There have been meaningful changes. They are all significantly at risk. Now, you asked me to talk about the sort of internal makeup of the country, and fortunately the meeting will extend into next week, and giving us time, therefore, to discuss the complete cultural anthropology of Afghanistan. Obviously, I can't do very much with that in this short time. Let me just make one further point other than this argument about economic improvement, development change, and a new youth culture, which is to say that many Americans tend to view the Afghan war in a similar lens to the Iraq war through the kind of framework of ethnicity. Afghanistan is an ethnically divided country. The Pashtuns of the south and the east are the majority group, but there are also Tajiks and Uzbeks in the north, Hazaras in the west, and a variety of other smaller ethnic groups. During the Civil War, warlord armies tended to shape up along ethnic lines. And some people have argued that the war that we've seen in Afghanistan is an ethnic civil war, the solution for which should be ethnic partition, create a Pashtunistan in the south, a Tajikistan, wait a minute, we got one of those, a Tajik area in the north, an Uzbek area in the north, and so on. The problem is that whereas Iraq was an ethno-sectarian identity war, the war in Iraq was not about politics in the ordinary sense of whose ideology should run the country. Nobody in Iraq was interested in ideology. They were interested in whose sectarian group would rule. Afghanistan, on the other hand, is not an ethno-sectarian identity war. The current president of Afghanistan is a Pashtun. Karzai stocked the government with lots of other Pashtuns. If you think of this as a Pashtun ethnic insurgency to overturn a Pashtun, it just doesn't work. The war in Afghanistan is an ideological war, where the central casus belli is whose governing program is going to rule. Is it going to be the Taliban ideological program, which Afghans have seen and don't like, or is it going to be something else? Either the kind of warlord government that we've seen increasingly under Karzai, or some more representative, less corrupt alternative. But the war in Afghanistan is all about ideas. And one of the reasons why I think this Afghan National Security Force can hold its ground, given the scale of investment we've made in it, whereas I don't think the Iraqi security forces are ever a meaningful prospect to stabilize Iraq as long as Sunnis feel threatened, is because whereas in Iraq, a completely mobilized ethno-sectarian war in which Sunnis see the government and its forces as a sectarian threat, in Afghanistan, you do have a large uncommitted middle which in principle might align itself with the state government and might get behind the Afghan National Security Forces, and in fact, the Afghan National Security Forces are immensely popular with the average Afghan. That's an important difference between these two conflicts, driven by a difference in the underlying demographics of the war and the resulting casus belli.
Just great. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to exercise the chairman's prerogative here and ask you a question. You didn't want to go back, you just wanted to go back to the 1990s. I'm wondering if you would mind going back to the 1980s. You said that the Pakistan's intelligence service created the Taliban. It's been said that in some way the United States promoted the development of Al-Qaeda by funding and supporting the anti-Soviet insurgency during the Soviet war in Afghanistan. I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
It's literally the case that money we spent went into the pockets of bin Laden and the people around him. The problem here, however, was, at the risk of sounding like a political scientist, wait a minute, I am a political scientist. You've got a principal agent theory problem here during the 1980s. We wanted an insurgency to kick the Soviets out of Afghanistan. We didn't want to send a bunch of American soldiers, and we didn't want a bunch of American administrators writing their paychecks and handing it to them in the Panjshir Valley somewhere. So we used the Pakistanis as the agent by which an American principal could manage this war. And at that time, the Zia government in Pakistan was busy Islamicizing itself in a way that it hoped would build a society and a military that could stand up against an India that they didn't think they could fight and win conventional wars with anymore. So what we were doing was we were handing the keys to people whose interests did not align with ours all that well. Zia was perfectly happy to take our money and send it to the most Islamist radical elements of this Mujahideen alliance because he thought that would suit Pakistan's self-interest. It didn't suit ours very well at all. And part of the problem we've had since, and part of the whole growth of Al-Qaeda and especially growth of other militant groups within Pakistan, derives from our willingness to let the Pakistanis do the dirty work of managing this for us and allowing them to realize their interests in the conflict at the expense of ours. I tend to be a little nervous about the argument that therefore we created this by funding Osama bin Laden. If somebody had asked the U.S. government at the time, of these various factions, who do you like better? The kind of radical Muslim extremist or kind of moderate, more secular folks like Ahmed Shah Massoud? I'm sure we would have said, Massoud. A, we didn't know because we were relying on the Pakistanis, which meant we didn't have to know very much. And B, we were relying on the Pakistanis, who knew quite a lot, but whose preferences weren't the same as ours. And the result is we ended up with our money making this situation worse, but it was kind of through a filter at one remove. And that's not unlike the general problem we face in this whole war. If you want to deal with interests that you think are real but limited and not send 500,000 American soldiers to deal with every problem around the world, you end up trying to rely on the locals. Help them help themselves. Enable partners. I love that phrase. The cliche in the Defense Department at the moment is we're going to enable partners. That's this nice, warm, fuzzy phrase for proxy warfare. And the trouble is, by definition, your proxies never share your interests completely. Never. I'm unaware of any example in which this has ever created perfect interest alignment. And when you deal with proxies whose interests diverge from yours, you get this kind of misuse of resources, at least at the margin. And that's the way I would characterize what happened in the 80s.
Thank you very much. There are a lot of other questions, but I'm afraid our time is up. That was a masterful presentation. We appreciate it very much. We'll break.